Okay, great. As many of you know, and probably have heard during the conference as well, the prosecutor at the ICC announced earlier this year that he intended to try environmental crimes without having to add any more crimes to the Rome Statute. And this statement was made against the backdrop of a global push to add the crime of ecocide to the Rome Statute. Now, the definition of ecocide is not agreed upon, and it remains unclear whether it should reach wartime harm by complementing the existing provisions in the statute, or if we should focus on, reaching peacetime harm. And indeed, we've heard both views at this conference already, and this is where my conundrum lies. What's the best strategy here to protect the environment? Let's see if I can make my little, there you go. So I think there are good arguments on both sides. And to start with the peacetime context, this isn't criminalized at all yet. It could be underlying conduct of crimes against humanity or genocide, but it's not criminalized per se in a peacetime context. Philosophically, many scholars describe ecocide as sort of the epitome of crimes against humanity because it's a crime against creation, which humanity is a part. And that applies in peacetime, and so ecocide should too. From a normative perspective, even though there are domestic legal protections for the environment in some places, some of the most vulnerable countries don't have this regulation or aren't able to enforce it, making environmental harm outside of the wartime context as lucrative now as the drug trafficking, just showing the impunity in this area. On the wartime side, the existing protections we have now are weak and patchy at best. So patching this up will be a priority as well. Philosophically, if we think that ecocide is akin to crimes against humanity, that reaches both wartime and peacetime, so ecocide should too. And then normatively, adding ecocide to the wartime context would provide more of an ecocentric balance to the anthropocentric Rome Statute as it stands now. However, the wartime context provides some additional challenges because states have been reluctant to set the thresholds lower than where they are now. They're very intentionally where they are. And so you might face a lot more challenges and battles there. And there's also an argument to be made that there are adequate protections as is, they just haven't been implemented or enforced well enough. So we are therefore at a crossroads here, ladies and gentlemen. Do we choose to focus on the peacetime context, or do we want it to apply broadly to both? And if I could see a show of hands for the people that think we should focus on the peacetime context, and for the people holding their hands down, you think we should focus on both? Okay, pretty broadly both. That's very interesting. My research looks at sort of the practical implications. If we add this to the wartime context, would it have a practical effect on some of the cases we all intuitively feel should be covered? Because if it doesn't, maybe the battle isn't worth fighting, right? And so my research looks at multiple different types of harm and case studies. My presentation today, since we were talking about Ukraine, will focus on the Ukraine case example and the incidental harm at Novikov-Gdansk. I have run through all of these provisions that we already have, of course, for war crimes, and I'm sure some creative lawyers will find others to use as well. There are also multiple definitions of ecocide that one could use. I have started out with the International Expert Panel's definition, just because it's been the most debated so far. It might not be the best suited for the broad application, but we could talk about that later. So moving on to the heart, the legal analysis. Let me see what I have here. So I only have time to cover one of the war crimes, but I'll also comment on another war crime that is potentially easier to meet at the end. We start with the incidental harm because it's the only sort of specific protection to the environment. You see the definition here, and then I have highlighted some of the elements I'm going to speak about more closely. So we're going to start here at element 4 with the contextual requirements. As with all application, we first have to look at the conflict classification. And at the time of the destruction, there was an international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine that extended to the territory where this dam was placed. And it's likely that the breach was associated with the armed conflict because it was a military objective through its location and potentially use. It was under Russian occupation, and it was likely breached through intentional or negligent actions by the occupying force. And so I find this to be green, likely met. And then moving on to the awareness part, assuming this was an act committed by occupying Russian forces, I think proving awareness also could be met. So we are green to begin with. Having looked at the contextual elements, we go to the beginning. Was this an attack to begin with? And the reason why this is complicated here is because some scholars interpret the law to mean that when you're sabotaging property under your own control, that does not constitute an attack. And so for the purposes of this analysis, I will assume that that can be proven, but if that's not proven, the other crime I'll comment on the end is probably the better recourse, destruction of property. There's an open question, but we will assume for this one. Then the heart of the legal analysis for this war crime and what most scholars talk about is this element, element 2 with all its thresholds. So to prove this element, it has to be proven that the attack would cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment that is clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. I think, or my research shows that the harm is likely widespread. In other words, covering between 200 and 20,000 square kilometers, depending on the definition you're using, because according to UNEP, hundreds of square kilometers were flooded and thousands of square kilometers of reservoir and wetlands were desiccated, and it even considerably affected the ecological connectivity of the pan-European ecological network of the PEN. And so, regardless of the threshold that you're using, the direct and reverberating harm caused by the breach would likely reach this threshold. And I find that it should also be considered long-term because, according to UNEP, much of the damage is highly likely to be irreversible, which should definitely be considered long-term, right? Finally, the harm to the environment should also be considered severe. According to UNEP, the breach directly affected as many as 59 nationally protected areas, 10 Emerald Network Site 5 Ramsar Convention protected wetlands, and 1 UNESCO Map Biosphere Reserve, causing irreversible consequences for their biological diversity. So here I find that is likely met. The harder question is whether it's clearly excessive. So given the very limited case law we have on this topic and courts' general reluctance to make this value judgment, it's not even clear that a panel would tackle this head on, but I think an alternative path that they potentially could look at are the precautions that were taken in this instance, which is also legally required. In other words, if the purpose of the breach was to halt a Ukrainian advance, as has been speculated, could this have been done in another way with less harm to the environment? And I think this turns on how imminent the threat was. If you were to compare it to sort of the only case is comparable from the Nuremberg trials with the scorched earth in the northern parts of my home country of Norway. There was sort of an imminence requirement and some other elements where if you can show that there were other things that could have been done and it wasn't as imminent, maybe the case would turn out differently here. But it remains a little bit of an open question. But finally, it's not enough that you meet all of these thresholds. You also need to prove knowledge, and the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the perpetrator knew that it would meet all these thresholds at the time of the attack, which is extremely hard to determine, right, without any further evidence of how they were planning this, what they were thinking about. But I think if you can prove that it was intentional, if there was time, if they didn't do the necessary precautions, and I know there's a lot of ifs here, then there is a chance, I think, that the perpetrator would be hard pressed to show that they didn't know that massive amounts of water would cause a massive amount of destruction. Just from a layman's perspective, but it still remains somewhat of an open question. So from this orange and green here, you see that it is possible, but kind of unknown, but not impossible. So moving on to ecocide, we have a few elements here as well, where I've highlighted what I will be tackling. First here, the prosecutor has proved that the act is either unlawful or wanton. I think this action is likely to be found unlawful under both international and domestic law. Internationally, it's likely that this is a violation of international humanitarian law, even if it's not a war crime. The threshold in international humanitarian law is lower. And under domestic law, while I'm not familiar with the domestic code in Ukraine intimately, I'm pretty sure blowing up a dam without permission would be unlawful. But I think this part also shows some of the complications with this law, because that in wartime, the law is supposed to apply equally to both parties, right, in the conduct of hostilities. And if you implicate domestic law in this way, countries could potentially legislate in a way that skews the law in their favor, because they could give their own forces permission and not the other force. So I think this area is fraught with some challenges that might undermine the legitimacy of the law. In terms of, we found it to be green, but we found it to have some challenges. In terms of wanton destruction, I think this is also a complicated factor to assess in this context, because wanton is defined as reckless disregard for damage which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. And so this would make this would require the court to make a value assessment as to the social and economic benefits of the military advantage, which is difficult in itself. But then when you factor in differences between parties, for example, the social and economic value of defending your country's sovereignty and independence is sort of tremendous, right? While the value of attacking another country, I think a court would sort of say that that was present. So that also makes doesn't really fit with the wartime paradigm and the way that we think about international humanitarian law. So this remains somewhat of an open question. The second element, the prosecutor must prove that the acts were committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage. So this threshold is more akin to recklessness, which is a lower threshold than what we saw for war crimes, which means it's easier to meet. And it's also a kind of endangerment, meaning it doesn't have to have happened, you just have to have created a certain amount of risk, which also puts the threshold even further down. And if we think, as we did in war crimes, that there was a good chance to meet it, I think the chance is even better here. And so we put that as a green. And finally, the prosecutor has to prove that the environmental harm that could have happened was severe and either widespread or long-term. And this is also a lower threshold than what we saw for war crimes, because it's partly disjunctive. Severe here means damage which involves very serious adverse changes, disruption, or harm to any element of the environment. And we already concluded earlier for war crimes that it was likely severe, and for the same reasons of destruction and irreversible effect on internationally protected areas in the PDN, it's likely to be seen as severe under this definition. And then for widespread damage, which extends beyond a limited geographic area, across the state boundaries or is suffered by an entire ecosystem. And as we talked about earlier, here hundreds and thousands of square kilometers were affected, and it even affected the ecological connectivity of PEN, which is comfortably fit within the widespread definition here as well. And we don't have to really look at long term, but if we do, I think we find the same as we did for war crimes. Here, long term is irreversible or which cannot be redressed through natural recovery within a reasonable period of time. And we already talked about much of the damage being irreversible. So this is likely to be met as well. And so if you look at all the definitions together, you see a clear pattern, starting with war crimes on the left. Incidental damage is likely the hardest one because of the attack requirement and the tough proportionality and mens rea requirements, but it's not impossible to meet. Then the war crime of destruction of property, which we haven't talked about, but it's similar in a lot of ways, and therefore I think would also potentially be successful. It's easier to meet than incidental harm because it has an easier proportionality requirement and mens rea, but it has sort of the same questions with its proportionality. For ecocide, it looks like that is the easiest definition to meet with this case, but it has some definitional issues to sort of fit within the wartime context when it comes to incidental harm. And I think that might be what I take away from this first set of analysis, that maybe either you have to shape some parts of the definition differently to better tackle some of the questions in incidental harm, or you have to maybe restrict it to other parts of the environmental harm, such as extraction of natural resources, where you don't have this war fighting element that makes it kind of hard to balance. And just as a final remark, I'm here really just talking about the practical consequences. While I agree with Maxim that spoke yesterday that normatively ecocide just really punishing the behavior that you think is condemnable is the better option.
Yep. Thank you so much. The logical flow from that, Flaviano is going to be our next presentation. Now we have to focus on the evidence that's necessary to go forward with these legal processes.
Please prove my case, Flaviano. Please prove my case.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Flaviano Bianchini, and I'm the founder and the director of Source International, which is an NGO that provides scientific assistance to communities affected by any environmental damage or degradation that might affect their human rights. We work all over the world, and over the past 12 years, we have been working in more than 40 cases, including in the last 2 years, Ukraine and the case of Kakhovka Dam, where we have been involved in collecting the evidences of the human rights affect, the health affectation and the environmental affectation of the destruction of the dam. We have been yesterday in several panels, there have been discussions over the fact of the need of extensive evidences for a legal case in a case like the Kakhovka Dam, but I will also highlight the difficulties of getting those evidences in a war environment in occupied territories. First of all, I would like to
Maybe down. Yes.
Yes. Okay. I would like to you all know where the Kakhovka Dam is by now, but what I would like to see is the bigger picture. Where is the last dam of a cascade of dams, which are 5 or 6, on the Dnipro River? And the Dnipro River is one of the biggest rivers in Europe, and it used to be the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, and now the industrial heart of Ukraine. Keep this in mind, because we will see how this has an effect a bit later on. I mean, this is a picture that now all of us are familiar with. Dam was struck on the night of the 6th of June 2023, so a little bit more than 1 year ago. And the initial flooding involved 600 square kilometers, including inhabited cities like Kherson, where there's been 35 deaths officially, and total more than 50 persons lost their lives. And this is the first image that you can collect. So when we spoke all these days about evidence, remote sensing is obviously the first easy goal in a situation like this one. This is on the 7th of June. Now, there was a wave of 6 meters of water. This 6 meter wave basically destroyed everything in its wave, including whatever deposit of pesticide, fertilizers, oil tanks, whatever. But this is the bad news. The good news somehow is that this wave was so strong and so powerful that a couple of weeks later, everything was on the bottom of the Black Sea, which is not nice for the Black Sea. But in terms of the long-term damage that was mentioned before, this was not the most important thing. The most important thing, and here we have a little animation. You can see that the wave was so big that the water basically goes up on the affluents of the Dnipro River. This one was flooded on the other way. So the wave was so big that 30, 40 kilometers upstream, and I was there on the 12th of June. So I was there like 6 days after, and you could have seen flooded, and we were 20 kilometers far away from the Dnipro, so the water came up on the affluent of the river. But from the long-term point of view, as I mentioned, the water was not the worst. I want you now to see, this is what is normally a dam, okay? So this is for fishery, but the image, what is important for us is this deposit of sediment. So the dam works as a dam, actually, that stops everything, including the sediments of a river. And especially when the river is as big as the Dnipro, the sediments are a lot. This is huge. And this is what happened on the bottom of the dam. And now let me see if I can show you this. This is a short video of a dam in Iran, a small dam. You will see later on that it's a very small dam into a small gorge that has been closed for 10 years. When you reopen the dam after 10 years, this is what came out. And look at it. And this is a small dam closed for 10 years. Now, I think that Kakhovka Dam was one of the biggest dams in Europe and was closed since 70 years because we're building 53. So exactly 70 years. So the amount of sediments accumulated below the dam was what was more worrying on the long term. And those sediments you cannot see with remote sensing because it's just, I mean, take a satellite, you see just hurt, like literally. And when we arrived, this was the scenario in man. So the water was already lowering down. This was probably on the 14th or 15th of June. So like 10 days after, roughly. The water was already lowering down, but everything was covered with this thick layer of sediments, which it looked like this. And now back to the first image. Those sediments were not just regular sediments. Those sediments accumulated there the pollution of 70 years of the industrial hurt of previous Soviet Union and then Ukraine. So all of those sediments have accumulated all the heavy metals from the steel factories in the Dnipro, the arm factories in the Dnipro. There is this famous quote of Khrushchev that said that in Dnipro they were producing missiles like sausages back in the 60s. Just to mention how big were these factories of armaments. And you can imagine that the factories of armaments in the 60s in the Soviet Union were not the most controlled, environmentally speaking. So all of this pollution were accumulated on the bottom of the dam. And when this dam collapsed, this was spread all over 600 square kilometers. where there were crops, there were agricultural land, inhabited land, all of this. And another aspect very important, the dam here, when it was destroyed, all the lake, where used to be a lake, it was with sediments. In the city of Zaporizhzhia, we'll see a picture in a moment. Okay, this is like the animation from like the first month. It was also summer, so it was not raining a lot and it was very hot. So in a month, whatever was a lake, it is just a huge beach, basically. This is another, the other one was optical, and this one is infrared, but it's the same. So the reduction of water. And this is what it looked like. First of all, the reduction of water, and therefore all the fish died. I mean, fish died without water. That's not, you don't need me to know that. And this. So basically, wherever it was water, it just was a beach. And including the city of Zaporizhzhia itself, which is a city that has almost 1 million inhabitants, 700,000 nowadays, because a lot of people left. Basically, look at it. And the first reaction when you live in a place that is also warm and it's summer, and all of a sudden you have a beach, what is your first reaction? Everyone flew to the beach. Literally, I mean, the beach was crowded. There were people swimming, fishing, kids playing, but that beach was not a beach. It was just an immense accumulation of polluted sediments. And we were able to collect both the water and the sediments in Zaporizhzhia and in the area, in the flooded area around Mykolaiv and Kherson. We were working with the office of the prosecutor, so I cannot share the exact results because there is investigation going on, but I can tell you that all of those sediments that you've seen in the picture, that heavily polluted, mostly with heavy metals. Heavy metals that are not a direct, how do you say, a direct effect of the destruction. But then those heavy metals were accumulated, but they were somehow stocked on the bottom of the water. And taking out all the water, those were spread out. And an interesting point here that we have to mention is that, and came a bit to your point, of the long-term effect. Heavy metals are residual. They're there forever. I mean, they found heavy metals in the hair of Napoleon, who died 200 years ago. I mean, those heavy metals got accumulated and stay there forever. So on the long term, the effect will be really, really long term, like literally 50 to 60 years if you make a cleanup plan. If you don't, it might be hundreds. Then a few months later, they prohibited people to go to this beach. So, but this was in Zaporizhzhia, and all the other area we've seen there is a pretty big area flooded where there are small village. I mean, small villages and crops, and people still kept going. And apparently, I haven't seen it, but someone told me that some people start growing food in the area because all of a sudden there is a free land, so people were growing food. And obviously this will accumulate all the metals and goes into the people. So the last thing that we did in order to demonstrate this impact is that we collect in January 15 centimeters of hair of children, and to divide it into two and see the previous 6 months, so before the collapse of the dam, and the last 6 months, so after the collapse of the dam. And we would try to see if there is a difference on a direct accumulation on the health of people. Now, I haven't spoken that much about the difficulties, but I still have 2 minutes. So the difficulties of war in occupied territory and war zones, first of all, just to collect the samples, you can imagine, you have to wait the right moment, there's constant shelling, you cannot go everywhere, you cannot go in the occupied territories, you cannot go during period of shelling, you cannot go in some area because the period of shelling is always, like in Kherson, for example, we only managed to take 2 samples and in a very adventurous way, let's say. And also, it was not easy to do this type of investigation because how do you find 100 kids? Because schools are closed. I mean, the easiest way to find 100 kids is just go to a school, but schools are closed because the kids in Zaporizhia, they do remote learning because schools cannot guarantee a shelter for everyone. So we had to just spend time to find those kids, bring them to the shelters, and then collect the hair. And obviously, another issue is that it's a war area, so shipping companies doesn't work very regularly. So we collect the hair sample in January, and they are still there. So we still not managed to bring those samples outside the country because there's no certified. I mean, there's only one certified shipping company that is still working here, and it makes it very complicated. I mean, I will save you from this. It's not particularly interesting, but so there is a lot of complication when you work in this kind of situation. And but yeah, I mean, just to summarize, I think we have some data, not a lot. Obviously, it's not as strong as we would like because of all the difficulties in doing this type of analysis. But I think there's a strong, solid data on the fact that there will be a very long effect of the destruction of them. And just one more word, when we think about the knowledge, whoever destroyed the dam was whoever gave the order. I mean, you don't need to be an expert on environment and water to understand that if you destroy one of the biggest dams in Europe, you will cause an environmental damage on a large scale. So I think on that sense, there is also enough, I mean, to me, on a common sense evidence, let's put it like this. Thank you.
Thank you. So for our last presentation, we have these efforts to collect data and ability are ongoing, so it's reconstruction. So we'll talk about training just cities.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you, Flaviano, for such important work you are doing, because I'm sure it will help Ukraine to show its place in the court and receive its payoffs for the crimes that happened. Unfortunately, Ukraine is well known for destruction, death, crime, atrocities. Today, I want you to present another point of view on Ukraine, a bit positive, in the middle of such a hard time for the country, and maybe it will somehow a bit promote it for you, and you would like to visit to see it yourself. So I want to bring to your attention a study devoted toward just green cities in wartime, evidence from Ukraine. The Russian war against Ukraine is a large-scale challenge for all socio-economic and environmental spheres in the country. For all Ukrainian cities and towns, the situation is complicated by the constant threat of bombing, the migration crisis, the destruction of infrastructure and ecosystems. This image shows Bakhmut, which was destroyed by Russians, as well as many cities, towns, partially or fully by Russians. And at the bottom, the powerful flag and all the green decisions what destruction happened. This research aims at analyzing the opportunities of Ukrainian urban recovery and development toward just green cities during the war. Theoretical basis for the study includes 4 frameworks, given the prevailing focus, namely, the first framework in which the views of the authors focus mainly on 1 or 2 emphases, either a green city or a just city. The second framework, the most represented, is devoted to the concept of just green cities. The third framework presents a comprehensive view of the controversial just green city lens. And finally, the fourth framework sheds light on today's most sought after issue of nature-based solutions within just green city lens. There are papers devoted to the city's sustainability and resilience, particularly during and after natural disasters caused by global climate change. And there are practically no works that would investigate this question during a long-term goal. Methodology. In our study, a qualitative research approach was chosen. A content analysis of Ukrainian city and organization website data has been completed, followed by preliminary and formal discussions with professional environmentalists in Ukraine. The formal semi-structural interview process is now underway. To support our study, we additionally used both publicly available sources, particularly social media pages, a variety of articles and videos related to the Ukrainian towns and cities, considering through a just city lens and official relevant documents. In conducting the thematic analysis of the preliminary data that will be updated after the interviews are completed, we structured the data into code themes and aggregated dimensions. The coding process was carried out in 3 stages. We used an iterative method to move from the obtained data to the relevant literature. According to the results of the thematic analysis of the data, the factors of urban resilience toward just in cities in Ukraine during the war are as follows. The first set is conflicting factors. Factors that hinder or call into question opportunities of restoring Ukrainian cities as just and green in wartime. Include such factors as conceptual contradictions, high threat level and investment risks, inertia and formalization of relevant activity, non-integrated municipal asset management. The second set of synergetic factors, factors that contribute to recovery and create additional advantages for the recovery of Ukrainian cities during and after the war, from the point of view of the just green city concept, includes such factors as international support and national policy, strong role of local authorities, broad-based public engagement, combining the recovery and development processes, just approach within nature-based solutions. And now I will focus more on each of the factors. Conceptual contradictions. Does the green city fulfill its promise for inclusive and far-reaching environmental, health, social, and economic benefits? Or does it create new environmental inequalities and green mirages? Such questions confirm that a just green city concept is very controversial. During the war, one may get the impression that security is a dominant factor, will only increase this contradiction. However, on the contrary, in the conditions of a common threat, it can rally all stakeholders around just solutions aimed at simultaneously solving social, environmental, and economic issues in cities. This inconsistency must be taken into account, first of all, in the periods of urban recovery, since the inclusivity and sustainability in the urban space in the coming decades will depend on it. In other words, the principle build back better should include fairer and greener than enforced. Another factor, high threat level and investment risks. Today, we already understand that the damage from the environment as a result of the war, in some cases, even exceeds the damage from the destroyed infrastructure. Statistics on environmental damage from the war, which unfortunately are updated daily, confirm these words of the Minister of Ecology in Ukraine. It is about more than 5,000 recorded facts of environmental damages amounting to more than 57 billion euros. But we understand that the real scale of the catastrophe cannot be reflected in monetary terms. And unfortunately, in the conditions of a high level of danger, investment risks do not allow us to carry out large-scale recovery of cities, even in regions of Ukraine far from the front line. Inertia and polarization of relevant activity. I ask you to take measures regarding the silting of the lands of the coastal protective strip of the Zamchitska River in the city of Kostopoly. This is one of the many recent requests of the digital platform Ecozagroza of the Ministry of Environment Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. Anthropogenic activities related to environmental pollution did not stop during the war. An important component of the work of relevant local authorities is the continuation of their normal duties, despite the fact that the war in the country has been going for the third year. It is impossible to move towards just green cities without solving urgent environmental issues, which are often related not only to the environmental awareness and culture of citizens, but also to the inertia and formalization of the activities of state and local environmental organizations. Non-integrated municipal asset management. The weak interest of local communities in solving environmental issues has an economic basis. This is confirmed by the data in the table. Natural assets are on average less than 1% of the total assets of territorial communities in Ukraine. At the same time, the best growth experience shows that local governments should consider natural assets first when it comes to delivering services to citizens. International support and national policy, these are synergetic factors. Despite the war and correspondingly high investment risk, Ukraine feels strong international financial support. Thus, EBRD Green Cities resumes work in Ukraine's Khmelnytsky. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Lviv, Kryvyi Rih, and Mariupol were among the other cities that received assistance within the framework of this international program. Such projects and programs that were launched before the war, thanks to a clear national pro-environmental policy, continue to operate in many Ukrainian cities. Strong role of the local community authorities. The position of local authorities plays an important role in this. Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, Bucha, Kyiv, and many other cities demonstrate a strong leadership position regarding the restoration of the city, in particular towards just green cities. The development plan, action plan Green City will ensure the ecological needs of their capital and a comfortable life of the residents of the metropolis. These words of the mayor of Kyiv confirm that before the war there was no such powerful plan implementation for the green recovery of the city, which includes many infrastructure projects within a framework of the reconstruction of the common urban space, in particular regarding the Pachina River, as the slide shows. So this is how the river looks like, and this is the project. Broad-based public engagement. Green reconstruction of Ukraine should be considered as one of the possible concepts of the post-war reconstruction. Implementation of such slogans is possible if the public is widely engaged. It should be noted that in Ukraine, the relevant processes are developing and in cooperation with local authorities and other stakeholders are implemented in almost every project related to the green reconstruction of cities, in particular Bucha, which the slide demonstrates. Combining the recovery and development processes. Despite the fact that there is war, we need to present our plans now, so that investors study these projects and make informed decisions. Kharkiv is one of those cities that at the level of project management demonstrate the possibilities of simultaneous recovery and development of the city. If we are talking about just green cities and accordingly green infrastructure as a design of a socially oriented green space, as the slide demonstrates, then the process of recovery and further sustainable development are resolved only in the interrelationship. Just approach within nature-based solutions. Adaptation to climate change must also be taken into account in the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, because its goal is not only to restore the destroyed, but to do better. The images on the slide show that the simple budgetary nature-based solutions regarding mostly landscaping of public spaces as an important component of a just green city are implemented even during the war in all regions of Ukraine. from left to the right. A green roof on a villa in Dnipro, a pocket park in Kiev, a green parking lot in Khmelnytsky, a rain garden in Lviv, a test plot with various herbs along the tram tracks in Vinnytsia. The fact that the activity during the war is growing in Ukraine is also interesting. Implications for practice and policies. The study has some implications for urban practices and policy, focusing on the necessity of municipal nature asset management and different nature-based solutions. As natural asset management is a relatively new practice, standard terms and approaches for its integration into municipal asset management frameworks are still evolving. And that is why it would be expedient to implement appropriate practices, primarily such as Canadian Natural Assets Initiative in Ukrainian cities, open to just green innovations. Our implications are relevant to the main program documents of Ukraine developed in 2024. First, the plan of Ukraine and relevant indicators, namely in the chapters decentralization and regional policy and green transformation and environmental protection. Granting communities the status of legal entities under public law will create prerequisites for streamlining the economic base of communities, and in order to integrate natural assets into the overall system of city assets. Second, in accordance with point 35, dedicated to the role of territorial communities and their natural assets and green infrastructure in the operational plan of measures within the framework of the new climate strategy of Ukraine. And third, recommendation 38, municipalities are among the key actors in recovery in an environmental compact for Ukraine. The process of managing municipal natural assets, starting with their identification and accounting, can contribute to the process of accounting and assessing the environmental damage caused by war. That study has analyzed the opportunities of Ukrainian urban recovery and development toward just green cities, exploring the spectrum of relevance, conflicting and synergetic factors in wartime. The study advances the concept of just green city in wartime, contributing to the literature in terms of urban resilience and nature-based solutions. Thank you for your attention.
List. I have a few questions, but I know we don't have them, so I think I'll open it up first. And then yes, we'll stop recording first.